Hello there. Tonight, we step off the main road and into a valley where evening collects and folds, and where a small door has been opening and closing for more years than anyone bothers to count. The air smells of time and warm clay. Somewhere a stream arranges itself around stones that already know their places. We are going to visit two elders, Baucis and Philemon, whose cottage is no larger than the space a generous story needs to breathe. No thunder, no hurry, only bread that rises when asked, oil that remembers the olive, and hands that know what to do when a stranger knocks. We will linger by the hearth, listen to stools creak the way old friends greet each other, and watch bowls learn their manners. This is a myth told softly, about kindness that does not pose for statues. Let the door swing on its friendly hinge. Let the night wrap around the lintel. Come in and rest. The cottage meets evening the way a careful reader meets a page, already turned to the right place. Roof reeds lie in neat, overlapping rows, each one persuaded by the last to behave. Sun-cured bricks hold a friendly warmth the color of toasted bread. A path the width of 2 feet runs from the lane to the threshold, edged with marjoram and 2 faithful sprigs of rosemary that have outlasted 3 winters by believing in themselves. The door is oak, rubbed with oil and ash. Its wooden latch keeps its shine from years of good hands. When it opens, the hinge gives a sound that is closer to a greeting than a groan, and the room adjusts its light to welcome whoever has chosen to come in. Inside, things are where useful lives have taught them to be. A clay lamp burns an oval flame that does not smoke. On the table, a folded cloth, a shallow bowl with a small shine where olives have rested before, a knife with an honest edge, and a pinch cup of salt that remembers the sea. A set of wooden cups stands mouth down on a shelf to keep dust from teaching bad habits. The hearth holds a low, reliable fire. Beside it, a kettle waits with the patience of a friend, and a long-handled spoon leans where a reaching hand will find it in the dark without searching. The cat of the house, striped like a soft thought, perches on the corner of a stool as if she were supervising good manners. Baucis moves through the room the way a river moves through familiar stones, ready, precise, without fuss. Flour dusts her apron and leaves pale thumbprints along the hem. Her hair is drawn back with a narrow wool strip that ties with 2 small tugs she has used for 40 years. She tests the dough under its linen and feels the live spring that means the oven will be thanked later. The oven door is no wider than it must be, its lips darkened by long practice. Philemon, at the hearth, arranges kindling crosswise with the small geometry that turns fire into servant rather than master. He gives the embers a breath, no more, and settles 2 split sticks where they will learn to glow. The kettle answers with a sound like rain deciding to be polite. The world beyond the lintel lowers its voice. Along the lane, a shepherd counts the last of his flock, quiet numbers, evenly spaced, then slides the bar across a pen that knows when enough is enough. A blackbird writes a final line and folds itself into the hedge. Distant roofs turn the color of river stones. The cottage gathers this softness and keeps it. Baucis tips a thread of oil into the lamp and watches the oval steady. Then she takes down a small jar wrapped in linen and holds it to the light. The oil within lifts a slow gold from the wick's glow. She nods, satisfied that there will be enough for supper and a little left to remember the day by. The knock, when it comes, is patient. It carries miles in it, and the courtesy of people who ask for what they need and no more. Philemon wipes his hands on a cloth kept for this purpose, the corner with the neat stain, and opens the door once, in a way that lets the night keep its shape. 2 travelers stand there, cloaks powdered with dust, sandals speaking of stones and turns, and a river that did not argue when it should have. They ask for water, and perhaps a corner where their road-weary bones can learn to be still. Come, Philemon says, because welcome is older than he is. He steps aside and leaves the path clear the way a chair leaves space for a second chair. Hospitality begins with water. Baucis brings the basin from its shelf and sets it by the door. She pours from the pitcher until the surface rounds the lip and steadies, then offers the ladle to the first traveler. He drinks, and the water does the speaking. Cool, clean, unambitious. The second cups his hands, rinses the road from wrists and temples, and lets the last drops fall back into the basin as a respectful guest returns a borrowed tool to its peg. Baucis dries their hands on the cloth that does no other work, then guides them to the table with the small certainty of someone who knows where comfort lives. The cat inspects their ankles, decides they are compatible with the evening, and retreats to her square of floor sun fading by the hearth. Bread asks the room for a little quiet while it finishes becoming itself. Baucis checks the oven with the back of her hand, judges the heat with a squint earned by years of pots and seasons, and slides the small loaf onto the stone. She listens for the first whisper of the crust and closes the door without letting impatience into the hinge. On the table, she sets out olives, a wedge of white cheese wrapped in a fig leaf, and a spoonful of honey the color of late afternoon. Philemon pours water into cups, and, because the night calls for a small courtesy, touches each with a finger of wine, softened, steady. He pours not by height, but by ear, stopping when the sound turns from hollow to friendly. A little dish receives a ring of oil. The oil's surface holds one curved reflection of the lamp and looks pleased to be useful again. Talk begins the way kind fire begins, low, with no need to prove itself. Where did your day start? Was the wind kind on the ridge? Did the mule take the second rope? The travelers answer in the grammar of the road, clear, brief, exact. They look at hands and cups and bread. They do not look at the shelf where private lives are kept. Philemon tells of a market morning when the scales decided to teach a lesson and how the baker's boy laughed first, which saved the day. Baucis tells of a storm that forgot to end on time and how, even then, the oven made bread because dough is stubborn when it wants to be good. The travelers share a whisper of a town where the streets are narrow and a bell rings from inside a fig tree at noon, a story that may not be true and does not need to be. The bread is ready when the loaf answers a knuckle with a hollow note. Baucis lifts it with a cloth, rests it so the steam can gather and learn its manners, then brings it to the table as one brings a small guest who will not stay long. Philemon cuts, not by hunger but by share, and the knife obeys without tearing. A piece for each hand, a piece for each story, a piece for the road that stands in the doorway like a polite stranger. The cheese offers its pale calm. The honey waits, thick but willing. The olives give their dark, sure salt and do not insist on thanks. Oil takes the bread at the edge and adds a shine that is content to be seen only by those who are seated. If there is a miracle here, it prefers not to introduce itself. The bowl that should be near its end discovers one more good measure along its curve. The pitcher learns that the last finger width at the bottom still knows how to pour. Baucis notices without changing her face. She does not test abundance. She cooperates with it. A spoon brings exactly what is needed, and the bowl continues to be equal to the request. Philemon pours cautiously, not to try the day, only to keep the table's grammar neat. The travelers, who have lived enough nights to know better than to tug at wonder, accept what is offered and return attention to the bread in their hands. Kindness, like muscle, grows by repetition. Bowls travel and return. A crumb at the edge of a plate is swept away with the corner of a cloth. A cup is turned so the handle waits on the drinking hand side. Baucis places the ladle with the grace of a good sentence ending where it should. Philemon moves the bench so shins will not learn to complain. The cat blinks in approval. The room learns its breathing. In the lift of the kettle lid, out as steam writes 3 polite curls and disappears. The lamp's oval stays steady when the door lets in a finger width of night. Even the hinge seems to understand that nothing in this house needs to be sudden. After second helpings have become third sips, after stories have set their spoons down, Baucis gathers bowls for washing. She carries them to the basin and lets the stream do its easy, faithful work. A single pass of her thumb along each rim returns the clay to readiness. Philemon stands the cup's mouth down on the shelf, edges even, so dust will not practice mischief in the dark. He lifts the latch, feels the bar, and finds it as he always finds it. Clean, steady, content to guard without dramatics. The travelers trade a glance with the pallet by the far wall, a question asked without words, the kind a house answers by changing its shape. Baucis lays a folded blanket at the head and tucks the corners with the same attention she gives to a good knot. Philemon places an extra log on the coals, not large, just honest, so the fire will have something to think about while people sleep. The lamp is turned down a finger's width. The room leans toward rest. The cat considers the fresh-washed bowls, decides they are above temptation, and curls into a comma that says, "Sentence complete." Outside, a breeze moves the rosemary and lets the stems hush themselves. In the lane, someone far away closes a gate, and the sound arrives as a memory of what being itself. Sleep begins where good manners end. The travelers lie down, cloaks folded under their heads, knees bent the way tired men know to bend them. Baucis and Philemon retire to their room apart, which is not far, because nothing in the cottage is far. The house lowers its voice and becomes the kind of quiet that listens rather than insists. The last small flame decides to be an ember. The oven, satisfied with its day, keeps only enough warmth to be friendly to morning. If a blessing moves through the room, it goes about its business like steam when a lid is lifted, present, warm, uninterested in applause. And you, listening, can let your breath learn the cottage rhythm. Soft in, slower out, until the door, the lamp, and the small, honest table belong to your sleep as if they had always been there. Morning does not strike the cottage. It arrives on quiet feet. A latch lifts, a hinge answers with its soft vowel, and cool air walks the floorboards before climbing the hearthstones that still remember last night's glow. Baucis ties back her hair with the same narrow strip of wool that has outlived 3 market seasons. The knot knows itself after 2 small tugs. She measures flour into a shallow bowl, pours water with the calm of someone pouring a margin on a page, and turns the dough until it accepts its shape. Philemon builds a small, useful fire, 2 sticks crossed like patient roads and a third set gently above, then gives the ember bed a breath that is more suggestion than command. The kettle ticks as it makes up its mind, and the room settles into the pace of people who have chosen to be steady. Breakfast begins as attention rather than appetite. Oil the color of a mild afternoon rides a warm pan. Batter spreads, loosens at its edges, and asks to be turned. Baucis obliges without flourish. A fig is quartered on a plate whose only ornament is the memory of hands. The knife leaves a clean line and retires with its edge safe from wanderers. Philemon waters the wine in the pitcher that knows their table and pours by ear, stopping when the sound changes from hollow to friendly. Bread from last evening has kept its good intentions. Its crumb meets teeth without asking for effort. Its crust remembers how to be serious without being stern. The cat performs her morning inspection, approves of what it finds, and harvests a square of sunlight that has unfolded by the stool leg. The travelers wake as if the room has been holding a place for them. Cloaks are folded with the care given to borrowed favors. The basin receives cool water and returns faces to their right names. Baucis lays out bowls and spoons with the precision of someone setting type. Each rests where the hand will expect it. She draws a thin line of honey that joins fig to bread without making a speech about it. Philemon salts a pot with the same small pinch each time, so the wrist will know when to stop before the dish learns a sermon. Words move along the table in a narrow current that never needs a bridge. The ridge kept a little wind. Geese rode a line along the river. The market has promised beans, though the wedding shifted the day. Nothing urgent, all of it timely. If there is a wonder in the room, it has chosen good manners. The cup that should be nearing its end answers one more pour with ease. A bowl that ought to show the curve of clay accepts a spoon and offers what is needed again. No one names it. Baucis notices with the composed face she wears for weather indoors. She cooperates rather than tests, the way a careful walker matches step with a companion who has a longer stride. Philemon pours as if listening for a note and stops when he hears it. The travelers meet generosity with the skill of people who have learned not to tug at threads. They accept what is placed and return their attention to bread, to the clean weight of a fig, to steam rising from a pan that remembers every season. Work presents itself the way a courteous guest presents a gift, without making the recipient feel obliged. A shutter wants its pin persuaded. A strip of oiled cloth makes peace between wood and weather. A basket asks for new lashing. Willow binds the rim and pretends it never thought about loosening. The door jamb has swelled. A shallow plane and a whisper of oil restore its temper so the hinge can go on singing vowels instead of consonants. Philemon climbs the small ladder to tuck a reed where the roof has grown forgetful. One traveler steadies the ladder without being asked, and the other gathers trimmed ends for the evening's small heat. The yard approves of such arrangements by smelling faintly of rosemary and sun on clay. By midday the light changes its mind, and the room cools a degree. Shadows trade corners. The cat redraws her geometry. Baucis loosens the lid on a jar opened only on days that have behaved, and a breath of marjoram and thyme makes the air more interesting without trying to be important. A pot receives barley the way a letter receives a seal. Bubbles rise in even ranks and decide to keep order. Philemon brings in a jug that has never failed him and tips it with respect. The last finger width at the bottom gives as if it had rehearsed. He does not nod at the jug. He nods at the hour, which has turned out well so far. On the table, the knives lie with their edges facing away. The cups wait with their mouths down. The cloth sits folded, square as a good promise. A knock touches the door and changes nothing about the room's balance. A neighbor has come with a narrow question about a fence line and leaves with a biscuit, a dab of oil on its heel, and the feeling that decisions can be kinder than they appear from a distance. The travelers offer to fetch water from the spring. The walk teaches them the lane's quiet numbers, 14 steps to the rosemary, 12 to the gate, a pause where the hedge gives up a lark. When they return, the basin receives what the hill returns, and Baucis schemes a leaf no bigger than a fingernail from the surface with the same care she would give a guest's name. The house approves by lowering its voice half a tone. Afternoon leans toward rest the way a good sentence leans toward its period. Tools find their hooks. Thread warms on a wrist, and then agrees to travel through an eye that refuses to squint. Philemon rubs the latch with a smear of ash and oil until the wood forgets every unkind thought it had about damp. Baucis checks the proving bowl and finds that yeast has kept its side of the bargain. The dough is turned, covered, and granted its small, private hour. On the sill, 2 figs reconsider sunlight and change their minds. The cat shifts to follow a beam and discovers it has been lured. She forgives it and blinks herself back to approval. Evening returns as if it had been promised a seat. The kettle stutters, then remembers itself. The first loaf yields a hollow note to an experienced knuckle. Baucis wraps it in a cloth that can carry heat without complaint. She sets olives in their little bath and encourages them with a ribbon of oil that makes their edges less certain. Philemon touches the pitcher and finds it equal to one more round. He does not make a ceremony of it. He pours low, so the liquid will not boast. The travelers watch with the calm of people who prefer the shape of gratitude to the sound of it. The table learns once more how to be full without becoming proud. Night rehearses its lines. 1 star, then another, a breeze that reads the rosemary and decides not to argue, a gate somewhere down the lane that closes like a sentence that has earned its period. The palate is made ready without comment. The extra log is placed with the exactness that keeps a fire from thinking too well of itself. Baucis sets the ladle so its handle points toward the hand that will reach for it first. Philemon turns the lamp wick until the flame is an oval that will not smoke. The basin is emptied, wiped, and left with its mouth to the wall to keep dust from learning the trick of falling in. The house lowers its voice and becomes the kind of quiet that listens. At the edge of sleep, the day folds into itself like cloth that has been ironed and laid flat. The traveler's knees bend the way tired men know to bend them. Baucis thinks of the loaf and the sound it made when it was done. Philemon thinks of the hinge and the good vowel it sang at dawn. The room's last instructions are small and decent. Leave the knife with its edge turned. Rest the cup upside down. Let the door bar settle without a thud. If a blessing passes through, it is like steam lifted when a lid is raised, warm, present, and uninterested in applause. And you, lying in your own harbor of blankets, can let your breath borrow the cottage's pace, soft in, slower out, until bread, bowl, lamp, and latch become the furniture of sleep. Evening has a way of finding its seat in this cottage. The lamp lowers itself to a calm oval. The hearth learns a steady red. The room forgets to cast hard shadows. Baucis sets the little table so that plates do not bump, and Philemon adjusts the bench by a thumb's width so knees will not meet with complaint. The travelers sit the way practiced walkers sit, with their cloaks folded under their backs and their hands returned to themselves. Outside, the lane gives one last rumor of footsteps and then decides the night can do the rest. Inside, the air smells of warm bread, time pressed between fingers, and a mild suggestion of smoke that minds its manners. They begin with simple foods that understand their place. Olives, dark and sure, rest in a shallow bowl that has known them before. A wedge of white cheese waits under its fig leaf. Bread moves from hand to hand in pieces chosen by share rather than by appetite. Oil draws an amber ring on a small dish and catches the lamp's reflection the way a quiet eye catches a thought. Philemon waters wine in the clay pitcher, lifts each cup only as high as needed, and stops pouring when the sound turns from hollow to friendly. No one speaks loudly. No one asks for more than the table has already promised to give. When the first cup is drained and set down, Baucis tilts the pitcher and tips a little more, only to find that the measure at the bottom has become equal to the request. She does not change her face. She tilts again with the care one gives a sleeping child, and again a courteous depth appears. Philemon notices in the way an old carpenter notices a true line and keeps his hands even. The travelers drink as guests drink in a house that understands work, grateful, steady, not to test anything, only to accept. The bowl of olives gives one more round along its curve. The loaf that should be nearly done breaks into a last agreeable heel without complaint. The lamp holds its oval and refuses to smoke. Stories gather like small plates. Philemon offers a memory of a year when the river forgot itself and wandered through the lower field, and how afterward the soil learned a better grain. Baucis speaks of a winter when the wind argued at the door and was taught to mind the latch with a thread of wool and a little prayer that sounded like advice. One traveler smiles at the cat, who pretends not to be a cat for as long as necessary and then returns to being exactly one. The other asks the kind of question that is not a test, whether the oven was built in spring or autumn, and whether the stones preferred one season for learning their shape. Answers come without embroidery. The table approves of this pace and proves it by keeping everything level. It is the moment when hosts, wishing to do right by the old rules, consider a larger kindness. Baucis looks toward the small yard where a stubborn goose has made itself half guardian and half scold, and Philemon remembers the words he learned as a boy about greeting guests with more than bread. They trade a glance that has practiced kindness for decades. Then the goose, hearing its name only in their minds, mutters from the yard and thumps its feet as if to plead its case. Baucis thinks of the honest racket it raises when a fox wanders near, and of the pale eggs that sometimes arrive where no one expects them. She sets her hand flat on the table. Philemon nods, having arrived at the same answer by a different door. The larger kindness will be the smaller one. The goose will keep its post. Perhaps it is because the mind has chosen modesty that the pitcher decides to be modest in a generous way. Philemon lifts it once more, expecting the last finger width to play out its duty, and finds the weight still friendly in his palm. He pours in a thin thread, not to prove anything, only to keep the table's grammar neat, and the cups agree. Baucis follows with water for balance, and the surface answers by learning a round light from the lamp all over again. The travelers say nothing. One of them bows his head a touch farther than needed for the cup, as if thanking the road that brought him here. The other rests a hand on the tabletop with fingers that have known long miles, and lets the wood take their weight. The kitchen breathes its little miracles like a baker's cloth breathes steam. A spoon returns to the bowl and finds exactly what it came for. A crust that cooled an hour ago breaks with a sound kind to ears at the end of a day. The knife, turned with its edge away, lies like a promise that tomorrow's bread will be treated with the same fairness. Baucis wipes a rim with the corner of her cloth, not for show, not to correct a fault, simply because the mouth that meets a cup has a right to meet it clean. Philemon moves the bench once more, a thumb's width only, and the traveler's knees discover that comfort is sometimes the length of a thumbnail. They speak of small things that hold large rooms. The well on the edge of the lane, and the way the rope must be looped so it will not fray where the stone is honest about its roughness. The wind that comes down from the hill at sundown, and how a shutter pin, if set not too tight and not too loose, will allow the air to pass without complaint. A bit of fence that always leans toward generosity and must be taught, once each spring, that boarders are not unkind when they mind themselves. The travelers listen like people who have heard many kinds of advice and prefer the kind that a hand can carry. When the eating ends, gratitude is not a speech, it is an arrangement. Baucis sets bowls where water can find them and gives each rim the pass of a thumb that remembers every plate it has met. Philemon turns the pitcher just so, rests it on its shoulder, and lets the last 2 drops return to the lip rather than the table. A cup is placed mouth down. A knife is rotated 1 finger's width farther from where a searching hand would meet it in the dark. The lamp lowers again without complaint. The hearth keeps a plan of coals that will still be thinking in the morning. The cat reviews the room and approves the thought. Sleep approaches as a guest who knows the door. Baucis lays blankets with the same evenness she gives to dough. Philemon places the extra log with the exactness that keeps a fire from imagining itself grand. The travelers straighten their staffs against the wall where staffs have leaned for years and, in that posture, look as if they have been relieved of opinion. The cottage closes its sentences one by one. Latch, bar, breath, ember, until only the soft grammar of rest remains. If there is a blessing in the room, it behaves like the steam from a pot when the lid is lifted. It does its work. It does not ask to be seen. Before eyes give up their last task, there is a small understanding shared without words. Baucis touches the pitcher with the back of her fingers. Philemon glances at the bowl that kept its curve. The travelers look at the door that knew how to open and promises to close without a thud. This, they agree, is enough. A house that can hold an evening like this can hold a life. The cat, who understands only what cats must understand, becomes a comma in the corner, and the sentence of night continues, slow and sure, across the page. Morning wears its plain cloak, and the cottage approves. The lamp's wick is trimmed to a clean oval. The hearth keeps a small, useful red. The table waits with its grain running straight as a good thought. Baucis brushes flour from her apron, checks the dough under its linen, and listens with 2 fingers to the quiet spring that means the oven will be thanked later. Philemon oils the latch and lifts the bar to feel its weight. Wood answers with the same agreeable vowel it sang at dawn. The travelers sit where evening taught them to sit, shoulders set loose by sleep, hands ready to be useful if usefulness presents itself. In the yard, the goose patrols as if the fence line were a sentence that must be read each hour to keep its meaning. Work arrives without parade. A shutter pin accepts persuasion. A basket's rim is lashed with green willow and decides to behave. The two guests carry water from the spring and return with the practiced balance of people who trust feet and wrists more than words. When the basin is full, Baucis schemes a leaf from the surface and sets 3 cups nearby, their mouths down, so dust will forget them. She opens the jar of oil, tilts it toward the lamp to see what the light will say, and smiles at the slow gold that makes no promises and keeps them anyway. Philemon steps into the yard and looks up at the roofline where reeds have shifted. He climbs the small ladder, tucks a new piece under the old, and climbs down as if the latter and he had learned each other's names. Toward midday, the road sends a handful of small weather. A breeze explores the rosemary, finds its manners, and continues. The sun decides on a pace that spares shadows the trouble of running. A neighbor passes at the lane with a nod that counts as a sentence in this place. Inside, Baucis lays out olives and bread and white cheese, sets a spoon of honey near a plate, and draws a thin ring of oil that gathers light without bragging. Philemon waters wine in the pitcher that treats thirst as a work to be done, not a story to be told. When he pours by ear, stopping at the sound that means the cup has remembered its job. It is an old rule that guests should be honored with more than bread, and for a moment the cottage remembers the yard's loud guardian. The goose stands under the fig tree with the solemn nonsense of geese, one foot tucked, one eye pretending to be asleep. Baucis glances through the door. Philemon does the same. The old words, about roasting and welcome, come to the edge of the table and wait. The traveler speaks softly about roads and bridges and how a cartwheel will choose puddles if the driver will not. And in that voice there is a way of being at home with the world. The cat glances at the goose, then at the door, then settles her whiskers as if to say that some arrangements are not to be improved by zeal. Baucis lays her palm flat on the table. Philemon nods. The goose will keep its post. The larger kindness is the smaller one. Lunch learns this decision and approves. The bowl that should be near its end finds the curve to offer one more useful spoon. The pitcher, tilted with a respectful hand, discovers a depth that answers exactly what is requested and nothing more. No one counts. No one tugs at wonder. The travelers meet the house on its own terms, the way walkers match step in a lane without remarking upon it. They speak of hedges that keep their lines when trimmed after the heat, and of beans that mind their pods if the string is set while the plant still thinks it is unobserved. Baucis listens and passes bread. Philemon pours and straightens the bench a thumb's width, so knees will not hold a grudge. Afternoon takes its slow turn and brings a cloud the size of a careful hand. The light lowers by a degree. The air remembers water without deciding to fall. Philemon ties the reed screen across the window to invite a breeze that knows how to behave. Baucis covers the second loaf and touches the cloth as if reminding time of its duty. The goose walks a precise figure 8 by the gate and mutters to itself about matters beneath human notice. The travelers stand, offer to mend a fence stake along the lane, and return with a short story about a lark that tried to keep singing and forgot the end of its song, which made everyone along the path gentler with their own forgettings for the rest of the hour. With evening near, gratitude becomes practical. Bowls are set where water will find them. Knives are turned with their edges away. The pitcher is allowed to rest on its shoulder while 2 last drops gather and return to their home rather than mark the table. Baucis wraps the cooled loaf in a cloth that can carry heat without complaint. Philemon drops a modest log onto the small red and coaxes flame with breath that shows the fire a reason to work rather than a reason to shine. The house arranges itself, as it always does, to be a good place for people to put down what they have been carrying. Only now, when the day is almost done and everyone has become simpler, does a difference in the two guests declare itself, not by light, not by sign, but by ease. When one lifts a cup, the room seems to agree before the lip meets the rim. When the other sets a hand on the table, the wood remembers forests and ships and all the straightforward things that would can be. The goose, who minds what deserves minding, stops mid-figure eight and bows its long neck 1 degree lower than any goose would bow for anyone but certain weather. Baucis feels the old words about strangers and gods pass near her shoulder like a draft that knows the door. She does not look at Philemon. Philemon does not look at her. They both study the bread as if bread were the most interesting problem a table could offer. The travelers notice the goose noticing them. One smiles into his cup. The other turns his palm up over the grain as if listening for the faint sound a well-made board gives when it is glad to be used. Baucis reaches for the oil and thinks how a larger gift might be asked of them, and how certain gifts are best given by not reaching too fast. Philemon sets the cups where the hand that is thirsty will not have to search. The cloud that had remembered water forgets it again for now. The lane offers a cart's wheel and then decides that is enough. The house lowers its voice and waits without performing waiting. When at last the door is barred and the lamp is trimmed to its gentlest oval, the two elders lie awake for a short while in the way of people who are practiced at sleep but have met a thought worth holding. Baucis' thought is simple. There are times when saving a goose is the same art as saving a guest from being honored too loudly. Philemon's is not far. There are rules, and then there is the shape kindness prefers to take when it knows the room. Outside, the goose arranges its wings, declares the perimeter secure, and accepts the night. Inside, the house writes one more neat line in its ledger of small obediences. Door where a door belongs. Water where water is useful. Bread where bread can answer. The guests breathe as if they had always known this roof. The pitcher sleeps upright. The bowl keeps its curve. And the cottage, steady as a heartbeat at rest, carries everyone into the kind dark. Evening takes the cottage in its careful hands and turns it toward rest. The lamp's oval settles. Coals decide to think instead of shine. The cat concludes that any further supervision would be vanity. Baucis wipes the table in long, even strokes that calm the grain. Philemon sets the cup's mouth down and turns the knife so its edge will not surprise a hand in the dark. The travelers watch the room complete itself, the way a reader watches a sentence reach its period without hurry. Outside, the goose makes one unconvincing noise at a hedge that has never meant harm, then resumes its deliberate circuit. The air smells of warm clay and the last of the time rubbed between fingers hours ago. When everything that belongs indoors has found its place, one of the travelers asks, softly, as if borrowing a word rather than owning it, whether there is a rise nearby from which a person might see the line of the fields at once. Philemon knows the hill the question wants. It begins behind the fig tree and climbs without argument. He takes a small stick for the path, not as a staff, only as a reminder to keep the stride even. Baucis wraps a cloth about her shoulders and lowers the latch with the gentleness of someone promising to return. They step out together, and the door closes with a courteous sound that never thinks of itself as final. The hill is a good listener. It receives feet without telling them how to lift. It offers small, exact stones in the places where ankles prefer to learn attention. Wind walks rather than runs. A cricket tries one note and decides it is enough. Halfway up, Baucis looks down and sees the cottage square in its garden, the oven's mouth remembered by darkness, the water basin pale under the scrap of sky that belongs to it. The goose appears as a moving comma in the margin of the yard, punctuating its patrol. Philemon points with 2 fingers, habit more than need, at the willow that learned to lean, at the fence line that minds itself, at the path that has been kept from wandering by use rather than command. At the crest, they stand without speaking while breath arranges itself. Fields stretch like well-made cloth. A narrow stream takes the light it is offered and repeats it without showing off. The travelers look as if they have been here before, or somewhere like it, places that hold work and peace in the same hand. One turns a little in the breeze, and, still looking outward, asks the question that houses sometimes whisper to people when the hour is right. What would you keep, if keeping were a kind of thank you? The words are not large. They arrive with the modesty of a bowl set in the center of a table. Baucis and Philemon do not answer quickly. They let the hill tell them what their mouths already know. Philemon speaks first, not to make a speech, only to let the answer begin. He says that a door that opens easily and closes without a thud would be worth keeping, and the strength to lift the bar each night without teaching the shoulder to complain. Baucis adds bread that rises on days when weather forgets its manners, oil that remembers the tree, and a table that can bear elbows when laughter leans on it. She glances at the cottage and then at the two figures beside her. If there must be a wish, she says, let it be to keep practicing welcome until hands forget how not to, and to do it under the same roof as long as breath finds us. Philemon nods, and the nod carries years. The travelers do not praise the answer. They do something better. They accept it as if it were exactly the size of the bowl they had hoped to set in front of these two. One says, in a tone that could be mistaken for weather, that such keeping often asks for a place to tend, walls to sweep, lamps to trim, a threshold to teach its hinge. The other adds, almost to the wind, that faithful pairs sometimes ask one last kindness when their work is done, to be finished together as a single candle that burns to its middle and then goes out without leaving the room at odds with itself. Nothing in the words announces itself as promise. Nothing hides from being one, either. They stand a while longer, letting the hill make its record, foreshadows the length of good planks, a soft clatter where a pebble prefers a new home, breath moving in the count that rooms teach. When at last they turn back, the descent feels like a page turning itself. The path knows their feet now. The goose meets them halfway and, after a thoughtful stare, decides that the party is acceptable. At the door, Baucis lifts the latch and lets the hinge sing its polite vowel. Philemon lights the lamp with the small pride of a man who still remembers which way the wick prefers to learn fire. The travelers sit where evening left them, and the room returns to its shape as if it had been waiting to resume a sentence. Sleep finds them simply. The pallet receives the travelers as it did the night before. The elder's bed takes two tired backs and asks for nothing in return. The lamp lowers until it becomes a memory. The hearth keeps an amber thought. Before her eyes close, Baucis feels the outline of a wish fit her like a well-mended cloak. Before his own due, Philemon pictures a door opening under a hand that has never forgotten the measure. Outside, the yard holds its breath in the courteous way of places that would like to keep what they love by not grasping. And somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, the stream repeats the lesson it gives to anyone who will listen. Enough is a good shape. Night arranges the room the way a careful hand arranges folded cloth. The lamp goes lower. The hearth decides to think instead of glow. The pitcher rests on its shoulder. Baucis smooths the table with one last pass of the cloth and sets the cups where morning will find them. Philemon checks the latch and lets the bar sit without a thud. The goose makes one small statement to the yard and approves its own work. The travelers sit the way practiced walkers sit at the end of a day, backs easy, hands quiet, eyes that would rather rest on ordinary things than chase after distance. Nothing asks to be large. Everything asks to be steady. It is then, with the room finished and the hour gentle, that a difference makes itself known in a way that does not startle. The traveler nearest the lamp lifts his hand, and the flame finds a better oval, as if reminded of a shape it had been taught long ago. The other sets two fingers on the table, and the grain under them looks more like a river than wood, not changed, only clarified. Baucis notices this the way a baker notices when dough has decided to be bread. She does not gasp. She gives the house a moment to agree with what it already knew. Philemon takes one slow breath that ends later than usual and lets it stand as acknowledgement. No titles are spoken. No light grows brighter than lamplight. The first traveler thanks the room for its manners, and in the sound of his thanks there is a weight that makes chairs feel well made. The second thanks the hands that poured and kneaded and kept hinges polite, and his thanks lands on the table with the same clean honesty as a loaf when it is ready to be cut. Baucis answers with the words she uses for neighbors: bread, water, a place for sleep, because that is what she had to offer, and that is what she offered. Philemon nods, because the words have never needed improvement. They speak then of the road that passed many doors today. Some opened a finger's width and decided they had opened enough. Some saw and pretended not to. A few opened gladly, and then remembered something urgent in the next room. None of this is said with anger. The room has no appetite for hard judgments. The travelers mention it the way weather is mentioned, clear in detail, soft in tone, leaving space for the mind to understand without being pressed. Baucis folds the cloth again along the same creases. Philemon adjusts the bench a thumb's width so knees will be untroubled. The cat chooses not to interfere. The first traveler asks a question that arrives like a cup set down where it belongs. If a gift could be given to this house, what shape would let it live its best use? Not a grand gift, a fitted one. Baucis looks at the door and thinks of how well it opens, and at the table and thinks of elbows and laughter, and at the oven and thinks of days when weather forgets to be fair and bread still behaves. Philemon thinks of the bar he can lift without teaching his shoulder to complain, and of the small yard where the goose keeps watch, and of the path that prefers to be steady rather than straight. They answer together without meaning to. Let us keep welcoming as long as breath will consent, and let the house keep its work with us. If a long ending is required, let it be one that is shared. The travelers trade a glance that looks like agreement with the hour. They suggest a short walk before sleep, not far, only to the place where the fig tree leans toward the hill. There is no hurry. There is only the kind of invitation that houses make to their owners when doors are good and latches honest. Baucis takes her shawl. Philemon lifts the latch and teaches it to close softly behind them. The yard smells of clay and time that has given most of its day already and is willing to give a little more. The goose falls in behind with the seriousness of small guardians everywhere. At the fig tree, something like a boundary remembers itself. The staff one traveler carries, which had spent the day being an ordinary stick, learns a leaf near its tip, not green like spring, not noisy like summer, just a simple, well-shaped leaf that looks correct against the dark. The other steps where the path begins and the dust takes the shape of his foot as if it had been expecting that particular foot. No one points. No one remarks. The hill holds its breath a degree. The stream below repeats its line in a slower key. The cottage behind them looks exactly as it always looks, only more itself, the way a name sounds when spoken by someone who has known it since the day it was given. They do not go far. At a small rise, the travelers stop and let the night continue its work. From there, the fields are squares of quiet. The road is a ribbon that has put away its arguments. The village beyond is a handful of low lights that have already begun to mimic stars. The first traveler says that morning will be kinder if these two stand beside them for the first light. The second adds that some changes prefer to be seen from a place one loves. The words are simple. They fall into the mind like pebbles into a bowl and settle without clatter. Baucis and Philemon agree in the old way, by remaining, by breathing with the hill, by watching the cottage as if watching a sleeping child. When they turn back, the cottage receives them with its usual good manners. The latch lifts easily. The hinge sings its vowel. The lamp meets them with an oval that is neither eager nor mean. The travelers take their places by the pallet. The elders take their bed. The cat, satisfied that all pieces have returned to the board, curls into the punctuation she favors. The goose declares the perimeter excellent and forgets to argue further. Sleep approaches as a guest who knows the door. It is not asked what it thinks of the day. It is given a place and accepts it. Somewhere at the edge of hearing, the staff on the wall makes the smallest sound a new leaf can make, which is not a boast, only the quiet of wood remembering a tree. Dawn comes as if poured from a shallow bowl. No splash, only light finding its level. Mist sits in the low places like folded cloth left out to air. Baucis lifts the latch and the hinge gives its good vowel. Philemon steps onto the threshold and feels the day weigh itself in his palm the way flour does before it agrees to become bread. The two travelers wait where the path begins, staffs easy in their hands, sandaled feet without hurry. A single leaf, new and correct, still rests near the tip of one staff, as if the night had remembered a tree on its behalf. They walk the small rise together. Dew seals the lane in a thin gloss that remembers moonlight. The goose escorts them to the fig tree, then decides the yard will require a report and returns to her circuit. From the hilltop, the fields appear arranged as they were, squares of work with their edges speaking politely to one another. Only now a silver is gathering in the furrows, not rain, not river, just water choosing the lower places and agreeing to lie still. It spreads as linen spreads when it is shaken out, smooth, steady, not in a temper. The cottages farther down seem to float in their own sentences, commas where paths once crossed, quiet roofs that will have to learn a new grammar for a while. No one is frightened. The travelers stand as people stand at the edge of a good view. Baucis and Philemon stand as they always stand, shoulder to shoulder, backs remembering their proper length. The first traveler says, in a voice that would not wake a child, that the valley is being taught a lesson about doors and welcome and the shape kindness prefers to take. The second adds that what is closed to need learns to keep its own company. What opens finds itself kept. Their words do not point. They place themselves on the ear like a soft hand on a table. The water completes another quiet inch, and then chooses to be content. The cottage below them looks more itself than it did yesterday, as a name looks when spoken by someone who has known it since it was given. When they return, the door opens without being told. The lintel seems straighter for wanting to be useful. Inside, nothing moves in a hurry, yet everything agrees to become better at being what it is. The oven mouth holds its heat the way a hearth holds a vow. The table's grain reads as if a careful pen had gone over it once more. The lamp, trimmed to a calm oval, appears to have learned a steadier lesson in light. Reed thatch settles and, without fanfare, remembers leaves more deeply, as if a mason had taught it patience one stalk at a time. The travelers ask, not as judges, but as hosts making sure a gift fits its room. If a blessing were to take the shape of this house, what would you have it keep? Baucis and Philemon speak the answer they gave the hill. Bread that rises even on a poor day, a door that opens without argument and closes without a thud, a table that does not tire of elbows and laughter, and the right to go on practicing welcome together under one roof for as long as breath will consent. The travelers listen and seem to hear more than words. Hands, habits, the clean weight of small obediences. They nod, and the nod carries an old yes. So the cottage accepts a gentler strength. Bricks learn stone without forgetting warmth. The posts at the threshold stand straighter and think of themselves as columns only enough to bear their work. The oven's lip keeps its soot and acquires dignity, like an altar that knows it is first of all a place where bread is thanked. The latch keeps its sheen and loses its stubborn days. The floorboards lie closer. The bench discovers it was meant to be as steady as a proverb. Nothing grows grand. Everything grows exact. A traveler lays 2 fingers along the table, and its grain answers by looking freshly planed. The other breathes toward the lamp, and its oval decides never to smoke again. Outside, the water reaches its line and rests. Paths become causeways. Hedges hold their heads above a clean mirror and approve of their own honesty. From distant doors, voices travel the way doves travel, low, intact, unflustered. The goose hops onto the lowest step, surveys her jurisdiction, and writes a small, satisfied hiss that could be taken for a hymn if one were in the mood. The fig shakes 3 leaves as if to count the new arrangements, and then declines to revise the total. Everything that belongs to this place, cat, bucket, broom, shadow, finds a better seat and sits in it. Toward noon, the travelers set their staffs where staffs have always leaned and ask for a last cup. Baucis pours, and the sound turns from hollow to friendly. Philemon waters the wine and sees the surface learn a tidy circle of light. The first traveler says there is one more kindness that faithful pairs sometimes ask when work is nearly finished, to end together like a candle that burns to its middle and goes out with the room still in agreement. The second, looking toward the yard where the fig and the little square of herbs have kept their bargain with seasons, asks whether such a finishing would be welcome here. Baucis sets her palm on the table. Philemon's hand arrives beside it. They do not look at one another because the answer is older than their faces. Years pass in the way well-made years do. Bread, harvest, cat, hinge, visitors who come in dust and leave with their shoulders lower. Seasons that teach the same lessons until the hands that hear them become fluent. The cottage keeps its vow. People begin to say temple when they mean house, and house when they mean temple, and no one thinks that odd. Baucis and Philemon grow light the way good tools grow light, because the hand has learned them so well it forgets to notice weight. One afternoon, sitting on the bench that has outlived many repairs, they feel under their palms a new temper in the wood. Less bored, more living patience. It happens without spectacle. Wrists learn a coolness that is not air. Fingers meet ribbed bark where smooth grain used to be and find the change agreeable. Elbows discover that leaning has become a way of standing. Roots, which must have been making their small plans for years, decide this is their hour and quietly thread themselves into earth. Baucis becomes linden first, leaves the shape of held water, sweet shade, a kindness that continues without saying so. Philemon becomes oak, stouter leaf, slower counsel, a strength that prefers to be furniture for birds. Their trunks rise near enough that a shared wind can move them together. Their crowns converse in a language of small applause. Visitors tie narrow ribbons to low branches and whisper thanks that are not grand enough for altars and therefore perfect. Children nap in the shade and wake improved. The goose, who has learned to be older than geese usually admit, patrols the roots and scolds only foxes and ill-planned baskets. The lamp inside keeps its smokeless oval for other hands. The oven endures as a mouth that feeds and a mouth that prays, which in this place have never been very different. When rain comes, it behaves like careful sweeping. When sun returns, it behaves like a blessing that knows to knock. If anyone asks what became of the hosts, the house answers by pointing at its door and at the 2 trees that lean toward it. Hospitality did not leave, it changed its posture. The table still holds, the hinge still sings a vowel, the bread still asks for heat and receives it. And on certain afternoons when the wind walks rather than runs, a murmur moves through linden and oak that sounds very much like 2 old friends agreeing. Once again, that welcome, kept and practiced and never made into a show, is a good shape for a life. The road does not keep a ledger, yet it remembers. Years after the flood laid a quiet mirror over fields and the cottage learned to be itself more exactly, small courtesies began appearing at intervals like milestones that had decided to be kind. A jug stood on a fence post where the lane crests, cool water for anyone whose mouth had been speaking dust. In the village, a baker set a cup by the door and wrote nothing. People learned to lift, sip, and set it back as if joining a sentence already in progress. By the ford, a boy who once hurried now waited an extra breath when a cart met a cart so the river could keep its own rhythm. No one announced these things. The road carried them the way a sleeve carries the warmth of a hand. Pilgrims arriving near dusk learned the place by its manners before they learned it by its name. They felt the latch yield without sulking, the hinge sing its good vowel, the bench take their weight without wobble. They washed at the basin and found the towel where towels belong and nowhere else. If a pot steamed, it did so at the pace that teaches breathing rather than rushes it. Children were taught the easy rites. Turn the knife's edge away in the dark. Pour until the sound changes from hollow to friendly. Leave cup's mouth down so dust forgets curiosity. And discovered, without being told, that the world calms when the small objects of a room behave. They tied a ribbon to linden or oak and felt the knot memorize their fingers. Sometimes a stranger, bone-tired and late to his own better nature, arrived with the look of a man who feared he had used up his welcome elsewhere. He stood at the threshold and measured himself against the quiet and did not like what his measure said. The door answered him anyway. It opened once, wide enough to accept a poor mood and a heavy pack, and closed without a thud. The bench did its old trick of keeping human backs from practicing regret. The bowl, which still knew how to conceal abundance without drama, found one more spoon along its curve. The man softened by increments, the way bread softens under a cloth, and in the morning he left lighter and took the habit with him, as if it were a loaf wrapped in a sleeve. News traveled out and returned diminished of wonder and improved in use. A herdsman beyond the ridge greased a gate latch with ash and oil and told his children why. So night hands will not learn a startle. A woman in a streamside town began setting her broom inside the door at the same angle each dusk, and her kitchen stopped speaking in stumbles. A stonecutter kept a flat knot in his cord and found that work argued less. When these people met, they compared stories not of marvels, but of measures. How far to turn a wick for a smokeless oval? How much to salt so a dish tells the truth without raising its voice? How long to let a door rest on its jamb before lowering the bar so it keeps its temper? They had begun to speak the dialect of the cottage without knowing they were bilingual. The two trees listened, as trees do, with their whole bodies. Linden held the summer sweetness just low enough that bees could practice without pride. Oak dealt out acorns one by one with the civility of a clerk who knows the names of regulars. In wind they conversed, leaf applause, ribbed patience, about the correct weight of a welcome and the correct silence after it. When rain came straight down, they learned it together. When it came slant, they took turns. Ribbons weathered into threads and then into nothing, leaving a light indent in bark that did not mind keeping memory. Under the roots, the soil arranged itself into rooms, cool chambers where water practiced stillness, and even worms seemed to work with a tidier grammar. From time to time a traveler would bring a story large enough to tempt the yard into opinion. A noble who shut his gates and found the echo of his own voice unpleasant, and in that painted its sign twice and forgot to teach its tables their manners. A village that learned to count visitors and unlearned counting bread. The place did not scold. It offered its counter-arguments and objects. The lamp's oval proposed an alternative to glare. The oven proposed patience. The basin proposed clarity that did not make a speech about purity. People listened with their hands, adjusting a hinge, squaring a mat, turning a cup, and left with ideas that fit in pockets. Once, late in autumn, a line of oxen with winter in their breath paused by the fence. The driver, who had been tight with hours all day, lifted his hat to rest his head against the top rail and forgot the race he had been running by himself. He watched the yard's routine, cat editing the afternoon with blinks, broom in its corner with the bristles sleeping straight, ribbon ends making tidy promises, and felt a small urge toward decency rise, like a yawn you can't politely refuse. He shifted the yoke a finger's width to save a sore spot, loosened the rope where it was learning a bad memory, and said, "There," to no one. By the river he passed the gesture to a ferryman without naming it. That night somewhere else, a door did not slam. Winter taught its own chapter in the same hand. Snow lay like a white sentence that ended where the threshold began. Visitors came fewer, and those who came stayed longer. The bench held backs that had been arguing with weather. The oven's mouth read the day into warmth. Baucis and Philemon ash trees kept shape and silence, and a green deeper than summer, the kind of green that belongs to keeping. Children learned to walk the narrow planks across the yard without scarring the new crust, and felt a small pride that did not need witnesses. In the evenings, neighbors brought stories already cooled to the right temperature and left with their shoulders obeying simpler instructions. Not every visitor understood. A few arrived ready to test a bowl, tug a wonder, or ask for a sign with a torch in the voice. The house endured them without riddle or performance. It gave exactly what was asked when the asking learned to ask well. Some left disappointed, which is to say unpracticed. Others paused on the lane, looked back at the door that had neither begged nor judged, and turned around to set a cup mouth down or straighten the cloth. The lesson seldom traveled under its own name. It rode inside other errands and arrived as habit. On a spring afternoon when bees traced their low cursive between linden and fence, and the oak was considering its first ledger of acorns, a woman set her palm on the bark and said, "May my table learn your patience." She did not wait for answer. She tied a ribbon with the quiet competence of someone who has learned not to over-tighten gratitude and walked away thinking about a ladle that could be set for the hand that reaches. Far off, her town's market shifted by one stall width, and nobody knew why it felt better. By then, the valley had forgotten how to be impressed by itself, which is the highest compliment a place can pay its own manners. People spoke less about floods and more about fits. How gifts fit rooms, how rules fit kindness, how doors fit days. The road, tireless, carried these fittings toward other thresholds. In the evening, when the yard becomes a kind of listening bowl and the air holds the mild sweetness of linden and the steady counsel of oak, you can hear what the road has learned repeating itself in low voices. Open, receive, share, set back in order. And if you fall asleep there, which many do, the last thing you will notice is the hinge singing its vowel to the night and the bench remembering every back as if each were the first. Late light comes the way a kind hand closes a book, careful not to lose the page. The yard wears its long shadows like a well-mended cloak. Linden holds coins of soft green against the sky. Oak keeps its ribbed counsel a tone darker. Between them the door stands as it always has, asking nothing grand, promising only the right kind of opening and the right kind of close. A pilgrim arrives with dust in his sandals and a ribbon in his pocket. He does not hurry. He sets his palm to bark and feels patience answer through the skin. Cool on one side like held water, steady on the other like good furniture. He ties the ribbon with a knot that knows when to stop, then sits on the bench that remembers every back and forgets to wobble. Inside, the house practices the same quiet craft it learned long ago. The lamp gives an oval that never smokes. The oven keeps a modest heat as if bread might walk in at any moment and ask to be thanked. The basin waits for wrists. The towel hangs where towels belong and nowhere else. The broom rests with bristles straight, ready to turn footfalls into order. If you lift the pitcher, it agrees to pour without boasting. And when you stop by ear at the friendly sound, it agrees to rest without complaint. Nothing has grown grand. Everything has grown exact. Toward the lane, children try walking heel to toe along a plank and discover they can arrive where they meant to arrive without stepping off once. A neighbor with a small question about beans stands under the eave, listens to the oven's calm, and realizes he already knew the answer if he would only let it be simple. A woman with a market list forgets 2 items and remembers one better thing: to turn the knife's edge away in the dark and spare tomorrow's hand a lesson. No bell rings. The yard conducts its little orchestra by example. Lamp, latch, bench, bowl, each keeping time, none demanding applause. Wind arrives with good manners and reads the leaves like a slow page. Linden replies in soft applause. Oak answers with the measured dropping of a single acorn, then another, as if closing a ledger line by line. Birds try a handful of notes and decide to keep the best two. The cat edits the afternoon with blinks from her corner of sun. Even the goose, now old and lightly dignified, patrols the fence once and calls it sufficient. The place has learned to say enough in a way that feels like kindness rather than limit. Sometimes a traveler asks aloud what became of the hosts, and the answer comes without voice. A shade moves over bark like a sleeve, and the leaves speak together the way two people speak after a lifetime of practice. No rush, no proving. A conversation that is mostly agreement. A breath later you notice the door again, and the hinge that still sings its good vowel, and you understand that hospitality did not vanish. It simply changed its posture. It can be trunk and branch as well as hand and ladle. It can be roof and threshold as well as bread and cup. Evening deepens by clear degrees. The stream below folds its silver and learns a darker grammar. Smoke somewhere far off writes one tidy line and stops. The bench gathers another back and holds it. Someone ties a new ribbon and smooths it once with a thumb, then leaves it to weather into memory. The lamp is turned down a finger's width and agrees to be small without sulking. The oven lets go of heat in a way that feels like counsel rather than loss. The door closes once, exactly right, and the bar settles with a sound that never startles. If you stay long enough, you begin to breathe the place's measure without trying. And slowly, the way a kettle accepts water. Out a little longer, the way steam leaves a lid without scolding. In with the scent of thyme and warm clay. Out with the day's tightness unknotted by degree. The road beyond the gate quiets to a low intention. The sky keeps a few faithful stars where anyone can find them. The trees hold their steady shapes and let night perch. At last the house writes its neat closing line. Cup's mouth down, knife edge turned, broom in its corner, latch lifted and lowered without a thud. The yard keeps watch the way good places do, by not fussing. Linden and oak rest in their true names. The ribbon does its small work of remembrance. And the bench, tireless, remembers one more back without keeping score. What began as a tale about an open door has become a way to hold the evening. It is enough. It has always been enough. We'll leave you here in the soft company of two patient trees, a steady door, and a lamp that knows how to be small. Let your breath take the cottage's pace. And softly, out a little longer, and let the room you are in learn these manners for the night. In a moment, the screen will go dark and an hour of gentle ambient music will begin. No more words, just quiet to keep you company while you drift. Sleep well.